Okay, boys and girls, today we're going to continue learning about note taking and focusing on what information do we need while we're taking our notes. Our teaching point today is that when we research, we do not have to take notes on everything we read. Some books or articles have extra information that we may not need to write down. We might already know the information, or it might not be important for our assignment. We need to find out what our topic is and what information we should take notes on. We're going to be doing a project in social studies and science that we will talk about later, but the big questions of this project are here, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, we are studying the seasonal patterns and hazards of weather and climate. This project will demonstrate our understanding of our reading and writing on weather and climate. The goal of the project is to answer the questions: 1. How do the continents, their landforms, and the oceans influence weather and climate? 2. How does the weather and climate of an area shape culture of community, including the habitat and food resources of the people within that community? Kind of big questions, but hopefully they'll start to make sense. So I'm thinking, should I take notes on this section? So this section's about glaciers, and so it just says, how do glaciers move? So I'm gonna read it to you, and we're gonna think about, does this kind of have anything to do with our topic? It says, glaciers begin to move when they reach about 30 meters, 100 feet thick. That's about as high as a 12-story building. The glaciers become so heavy that gravity pulls them downhill. Gravity is a force that pulls things toward the center of the earth. It makes objects fall and roll down slopes. The movement of a glacier is called flow. Okay, so I want you to think about, does this have anything to do with our essential questions? Now remember, here are our questions. How do the continents, their landforms, and the oceans influence weather and climate? How about number 2? How does the weather and climate of an area shape culture of community, including the habitat and food resources of the people within that community? I'm going to pause this and give you a chance to talk with your partner. Does how these glaciers are moving, talking about gravity and how it's pulling the glaciers down, does that have anything to do with either of these questions? So I'm going to pause it and let you guys talk about it. Okay, guys, let's think. I was looking at our questions, and the first question, how do the continents, their landforms, and oceans influence weather and climate? Glacier is a landform, but is anything in here related or talking about the weather, the movement of the glaciers? Is it talking about anything with the climate? I don't really think so. How about number 2? How does the weather and climate of an area shape the culture of the community, including habitat and food resources of the people within that community? Again, it's not really talking about the weather impacting any of this. It's not even talking about the resources or the habitat of the people. So I don't really think this section is anything that I need to take notes on. So I just probably would I'd look at it, I'd read it over, but I wouldn't necessarily take notes on it. How about this section? This is called when glaciers melt. It says, some glaciers melt or recede and eventually disappear. Glaciers recede when the weather gets warmer or less snow falls. Receding glaciers leave their moraines behind as long ridges of rock and soil. This soil is called till. It can be good for growing food. Glaciers may also drop huge boulders when they melt. Sometimes glaciers create lakes and ponds when the ice melts on the land. Is this section related to our essential questions at all? Let's think about it here. How do the continents, their landforms, and oceans influence weather and climate? How does the weather and climate of an area shape the culture of the community, including the habitat and food resources of the people within that community? Well, if I think about this, I'm thinking that, is any of this section related to weather or landforms? Is the weather at all here related to this landform of the glaciers? Is there any kind of relationship between glaciers, which are the landforms, and weather? Turn and talk about that for a second while I pause the video. Okay, maybe, hopefully you guys realize that, yes, it is kind of talking about weather. It's talking about how when the weather gets warmer or there's less snow, the glaciers start to recede. They start to kind of get smaller and they start to melt, and that can kind of leave behind some long ridges of rocks and soil, which is good for growing food. So that kind of goes along with the next question. Does it help shape the culture, including the habitat and the food resources of the people within that community? Well, if it's leaving behind all this good soil that's good for growing food, that's going to affect the people that live in the area because they can grow better crops. So it actually does kind of even touch on question number 2. Is it going to is that going to impact the community? Yes, for sure. Even how about when they melt? Some glaciers create lakes and ponds when the ice melts on the land. Well, how can lakes and ponds affect the resources of a community and the food and all that? Why don't you turn and talk about that? How does having more lakes and ponds affect a community and their resources? Okay. Hopefully you talked and realized that there is, when you have more lakes and ponds, you can have some fishing. You can get food that way. That would affect the community and their resources. So this section, I think, would be a good section to take notes on because it does kind of go along with our questions. It's talking about the weather and how that's impacting the landforms and vice versa, and how that also kind of helps the community and the habitat because leaving behind all of this soil is good for farming, which can make more crops, and also melting glaciers that make ice melting, creating lakes and ponds, can also have more resources for the community. Now, you're going to try this on your own. Now, I know this is challenging, but we're just going to give it a shot. If you go into Schoology, you're going to see this article here. It's about tornadoes. It's a very short section about Tornado Alley, which we talked about during science. So if you would just click on, if you go into Schoology, it's actually going to be in Language Arts, and it'll be called What Info Do I Need? Okay, so you will click on that, you will open it up, and it's a worksheet like this, and it asks you a couple of questions. It wants to know, does this section have anything to do with either of our essential questions, and explain. And then it's going to ask you to take some boxes and bullets on the section. So hopefully it kind of makes sense. I'll definitely be around to help, so just raise your hand if you need some help. Okay.